On April 4, 2023, Finland became the 31st member of NATO. With that, Finland became the longest neighbor with which Russia would be sharing the NATO border.
And Finland has decided to join NATO and be part of the world's most successful alliance. This has been the fastest accession process in NATO's modern history. Finland and Sweden applied for membership last May. In June, at our summit in Madrid, every ally invited them to join. And today, less than a year later, we welcome Finland as a full member of our alliance.
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a defensive organization which was formed by USA to counter the Soviet Union. Its motto is to safeguard democracy and help the allies whenever they are in need. The most attractive part of NATO is if one member country is attacked, Article 5 will be imposed, which means that all the other members had to participate and will defend their ally. Since Europe is divided into smaller countries, such organization and such security is needed in Europe. This is to give them a sense of security. When USSR was destroyed, many Eastern European nations also took the NATO membership and they applied for the NATO membership. It was Ukraine and Georgia at one point of time who applied for the NATO membership, and now in present we are seeing that it's Finland and Sweden who are interested in NATO membership, and they are willing to be a part of NATO by dropping their neutrality. In this episode, we are going to tell that why Finland considered to drop the neutrality and why Finland became a NATO member. Basically, I will talk about the journey of Finland from the neutrality to NATO. But before I move on to this episode, let me introduce myself. Myself Anindita Ghoshal, and I create content on international issues and history. So if you are interested in such topics, so please consider subscribing my channel. Back to the story. So in this episode, we will walk you through the several segments. So first is the historical segment, where we will discuss right from the Tsar rule, that how the relationship between Finland and the Tsar was there, and it went to the Soviet Union and even the Winter War. Then I will talk about the hurdles what Finland had faced regarding the whole NATO membership, and we will talk about that what Finland brings to the table and significance, of course, of joining NATO for Finland, for Russia, and for the NATO itself. So let's talk about the historical context. Usually the past influences the present, and it is true in the context of the bilateral relations and the geopolitics as well. So to find the answer of this question, we must go deep down and understand that how the relationships between these two countries were. So basically this all started in 1808-1809 when Russia took Finland from Sweden, and there were several reasons because of which Russia considered taking Finland into her domain. The reasons were: number one, Russia feared that the Germany would capitalize in their influence on Sweden, and she is going to use Finland to invade Russia. This sounds very similar to what Russia always says about the NATO, that through Ukraine NATO will come towards Russia, and there will be a NATO invasion on the Russia itself. Number two, Russia had concern regarding the St. Petersburg, the second largest city in Russia. In the Russian Empire, the St. Petersburg was an important city. This was also the capital of the Russian Empire, and it was said to be the window to Europe. This was capital from 1712 to 1918. That is up to the Russian Revolution mostly. It was founded by the Tsar Peter I, and this was as I said, that this was called as the window to Europe. And the St. Petersburg was too close to Finland, so it was necessary for Russia to anyhow to take Finland under their control so that they could save the St. Petersburg. Russia believed that Finland must accept Russia, as it was Russians who helped them. So to get free from the Sweden dominion. So their argument was that since it was Russia who helped them, so naturally the Finland should also pay back by accepting that Finnish people should allow their own people to join the Russian army and to help the Russian army. So these were the reasons that were given by the Russians so that they could have the dominion over Finland. Now when Russia took Finland from Sweden in 1809, Finland gained the status of Grand Duchy and it had their own constitution. So basically, though it was under the dominion of Russia, but it has the Grand Duchy, which means that Finland was still able to rule her constituency, and her constitution was also applicable there. So up to this, everything was pretty alright. The February manifestation of 1899 was the decree in which asserted the Tsarist government to rule Finland. It was done without the consulting the Finnish people. Now in 1899, what happened was that the February manifestation was drafted, and which gave the Tsar the sole control of Finland to Russia. You can say that it sounds like the centralization of the Finland, and all the powers of the Finland goes directly to the Tsar regime, and this was done without consulting the Finnish people. And when Finnish people get to know all about this, they were very much overwhelmed by this action, and because this was unpredictable, and they choose to protest. But eventually the dominion of the Russian Empire was ended with the Russian Revolution, and Finland was basically free after the fall of the Russian Empire. Established relations with the Soviet Union, but a big battle is awaiting them, and this is going to change the course of history. Finland's security was dominated by the fear that the Soviet Union would anytime attack them. So the priority for the Finland was to end the conflict with Russia and to sit with the negotiations with them. And the negotiations between these two countries happened in 1918 and 1920, which led in October to sign the Treaty of Dorpat. In Treaty of Dorpat, the Finland received all the lands which was held under the Russian rule, plus the Petsamo area, which gave Finland a part of the Arctic Ocean. The Soviet-Finnish border on the Caroline Isthmus was drawn only 30 kilometers from the Leningrad. Formerly, which was known as the St. Petersburg. And since this border was too close to St. Petersburg, the Russians were very skeptical, and they were ready for another negotiations or another treaty. Historically, it was Soviet Union which was actually a threat to Finland, because by the several means Soviet Union, the Russia had put their dominion over that country. But Finland was never a threat to the Soviet Union. But the location at which the Finland was situated, it was very, very important for the Russia to take care of her own national security. And it was believed that through the Finland, there would be a chance of the German intrusion. And to protect their security, Soviets initiated negotiation with Finland from 1938 to 30, but nothing was achieved. Finland assured that the Finland would never allow their territory to violate, and there would never be any threat from their side to the Soviet Union. But Soviet looked for building a base at the shore of the Finland, from where the Soviet would block the hostile force which would possibly invade. Finland government believed that accepting one demand would encourage more and more demands. Meanwhile, there were another parallel negotiations that were happening, and that happened between Soviet Union and the Nazis, and they signed a treaty which was known as the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. So the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, this basically it was a pact which describes that the Soviet Union would have a sphere of influence on Finland, Baltic states and the East Europe. But the pact was violated when Germany invaded Poland, and this put a lot of influence on these countries. The Soviets invited Finland for the final negotiations, but the Finland believed that these are the ways so that so Finland, they considered that it is merely a way to target the Finland, so they start to mobilize their own army. In negotiations, Soviet had simple demands. Soviet said that they want to build a naval base at the Gulf of Finland, and the intention of the Soviet was to guard the Leningrad, which is the St. Petersburg. In exchange, the Soviet offered Finland to have the 8,800 square kilometer of the Caroline, along with which the Finnish border, and this was going to be the twice the amount of the land that they had in. But the Finland's point of view was quite different. Finland was not in mood to drop her neutrality for anybody, and it is necessary to have the neutrality to save herself. So Finland was very clear about her neutrality, that no matter what happens, she is not going to take a side, and she wants to maintain her neutrality on both the ends. Moving the Finnish border on the Caroline Isthmus away from the Leningrad would give the Soviet possessions much of the line of the Finnish fortification, and loss of which could weaken the Finnish defenses. So if the Finnish border had to move from the Leningrad to the Caroline Isthmus, it means that all the Finnish forts which the Finnish had built there, it will be a great loss for them, and their defense security was compromised. And since nothing came out from the negotiations, so Soviet attacked Finland on November 30, 1939 without declaring a war. And this war was called as Winter War. As nothing worked out from this negotiation, so Soviet attacked Finland on November 30, 1939 without declaring a war. And this was called as Winter War. And it is also named as the Russo-Finnish War. And in this war, the tiny Finnish army took the huge Red Army. In this war, the Finland gave a strong resistance to the Red Army, but eventually the Soviet was the one who won. This treaty after the war forced Finland to cede 11% of her territory to the Soviet Union and get the rest of the country to remain independent. For Soviet, victory came at a huge price, because during the fight, the Red Army lost 300k soldiers as compared to the Finnish 65k soldiers. In 1948, Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance was signed, which was the foundation of the Soviet-Finland relations. So there are two articles there. Number one, it calls for the military operation between these two nations, and number two, the treaty calls for the military consultations precede actual cooperation. Here, Finland's security is being safeguarded. So basically these two articles talk about that the military cooperation, which means that from now on the Finland and the Soviet Union would work together. And number two, that if Finland or if other party is being attacked, the Finland and the Russia would be helped. And this also considered the fact that both would respect the sovereignty of each other. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Finland, like other Eastern European nations, looked for the NATO partnership, and in 1994, Finland became an official partner of NATO. But the question is that why suddenly Finland want to drop her neutrality and want to become a NATO member. So it all started when Ukraine wanted to join NATO, and Russia believed that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will be a security threat for Russia, as the USA will be at her border. But from the Ukrainian perspective was very clear that the Ukraine had already given up her nukes to Russia under the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia was also a signatory. But as Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the relationship between these two countries became sour, and so it was necessary for Ukraine to look out for a security grant, and because of which Ukraine applied for the NATO membership. But this thing actually ended in an invasion which Russia did the full-scale war on Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And Finland, which was historically abused by Russia and then Soviet Union, it was necessary for her to consider and to choose which was best for her. And she does not want to be threatened by the idea of the another invasion if she doesn't go by what Russia says. And so it was necessary for the Finland to drop her neutrality. Interestingly, Finland was also going to get the same luck as that of Ukraine when Turkey and Hungary refused to give the consensus to Finland and Sweden for the NATO membership. However, the differences were sorted out and the Finland got the entry. But seems like that the Sweden has to wait a little longer. So let's look at the criteria of joining NATO. NATO is open for all European nations which shares the same values as that of NATO. Number one. Number two, the one who is applying for the NATO should respect the sovereignty of the other neighboring countries, which means that they are expecting a good neighbor and it has to have a good relationship with her neighbor. Number three, they must work towards the compatibility with the NATO force. So the compatibility would be checked that if whether the force is actually capable to join the NATO or not. And number five, the army should be under the civilian control. However, all these points that I told you right now does not automatically give anybody a NATO membership. It is given through the consensus of all the members. So everyone who is a NATO member will give a consent for a new member to join them. And if any one country refuses to give the consent, the application of that country who is applying for the NATO membership will be rejected. And this is the reason that's why Georgia and the Ukraine lost the chance to get the NATO membership because it was earlier rejected by one member. Interestingly, it was Finland who was also about to get the same fate as. Interestingly, Finland was also about to get the same luck as of Ukraine, because the Turkey and Hungary objected to Sweden and the Finland to join the NATO membership. However, the differences between interestingly, Finland was also going to get the same luck as that of Ukraine, because Turkey and Hungary, they both objected to the Finland and Sweden for the NATO membership. But however, the differences were all sorted out and Finland got entry as a member. Finland brings 257,250 total troops, in which there are 19,250 active troops and 238,000 reserve troops. Finland has 100 men battle tanks and 107 combat aircrafts, 19 helicopters and 62 artillery. So basically NATO will be richer by getting all these resources from Finland, and Finland will also get the protection of Article 5 if she is attacked by the neighbor. Also, the NATO membership to Finland will also grant a security to the Baltic states and the Arctic and the regions of the Arctic Ocean. In the end, I would say that instead of pushing NATO away from Russia, it became more closer. The Russian war on Ukraine made the other countries paranoid of the situation, because of which the countries, they did not want to remain neutral anymore, and the divide was quite very vast in Europe. Finland is protected from any invasion because if attempted, NATO would be joining and defending them. So basically the war with Ukraine had promoted the NATO membership and pushed the neutral countries to be a NATO member, and by Finland joining becoming a NATO member, it became the longest border with which Russia would be sharing the NATO border. The reason for the quick membership is perhaps the NATO realized that what mistake they did by not letting Ukraine join NATO, and this is very clear that, and many Ukrainians believe that if Ukraine would be a NATO member, then Russia would never have dared to invade Ukraine and would to disturb the whole peace of Europe and of the global and disturb the global peace.